Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into the most private chambers of royal palaces, where love stories unfolded that could never be told, where hearts broke in silence, where duty and desire waged wars that no one was allowed to witness. We're going to explore the forbidden romances, the impossible loves, the heartbreaking choices that royal women had to make when their hearts pulled them in one direction and their crowns demanded they go in another. These aren't fairy tales with happy endings. These are real women who loved deeply, suffered quietly, and often sacrificed everything for love or for duty. Women whose romantic choices could topple governments, start wars, or destroy centuries-old dynasties. Before we dive into these stories that will make your heart ache, I'd love it if you could hit that subscribe button. It really helps me continue creating these bedtime history stories for you. I am genuinely curious. Where are you right now? Are you tucked in bed thinking about your own love story? Perhaps holding someone's hand as you listen? Or maybe you are alone tonight, thinking about love lost or love hoped for. Tonight's stories will remind you that heartbreak is universal, that the pain of impossible love has touched even those who seemed to have everything, that behind every crown was a woman who wanted nothing more than to be loved for herself. Wherever you are, I want you to dim those lights, get comfortable, maybe grab some tissues because these stories will move you, and let's travel through centuries of royal heartbreak to understand what it meant to be a woman who had to choose between love and duty. What if I told you that in 1953, a British princess was forced to publicly renounce the man she loved, reading a statement to the world that she was choosing duty over her heart, while millions watched her dreams die in real time? What if I told you that one of history's most beloved princesses wrote secret love letters for years to a man she could never be with? Letters that were hidden away and only discovered decades after her death. What if I told you that royal women across centuries have been forced into loveless marriages, forbidden from divorcing abusive husbands, separated from the men they truly loved, and required to smile through it all because their personal happiness was considered irrelevant compared to dynastic interests? According to research by Professor Carolyn Harris from the University of Toronto, whose work on royal marriages examines the intersection of politics and personal life, royal women throughout history have faced impossible choices between personal desire and public duty, and until very recently, duty was expected to win every single time, no matter the personal cost. Think about that for a moment. You are going to spend tonight with me exploring the most heartbreaking love stories in royal history. Stories of women who loved men they couldn't have, who were torn from the arms of their soulmates, who spent entire lifetimes married to men they didn't love while dreaming of the ones they did, who made sacrifices we can barely comprehend for the sake of crown and country. This isn't going to be a romantic fairy tale. This is going to be the reality behind the Eind, the Aras and ball gowns, the truth about what it meant to be a woman born into royalty, when your heart wanted something your position wouldn't allow. Tonight, I am going to take you inside the private anguish of real women who lived in gilded cages, whose love letters were destroyed or hidden, whose tears were shed in private while they maintained perfect composure in public, whose hearts broke again and again while the world saw only their smiles. Let me tell you about Princess Margaret Rose Windsor, because her story represents perhaps the most publicly heartbreaking royal romance of the 20th century. A love affair that captivated the world and ended with a statement that shattered millions of hearts along with her own. Margaret was born on the 21st of August 1930, the younger sister of future Queen Elizabeth II, and from childhood she was known for her vivacity, her rebellious spirit and her romantic nature. According to research by Professor Anne Edwards, whose biography of Margaret examines her life and loves, Margaret grew up in the shadow of her sister's destiny, knowing she would never be queen but still bound by royal expectations and restrictions that governed every aspect of her life, including whom she could love. In 1944, when Margaret was just 14 years old, a handsome Royal Air Force officer named Peter Townsend was appointed equerry to King George V. Margaret's father, Peter, was a war hero, a Battle of Britain fighter pilot who had shown extraordinary courage during the war. According to research by Professor Hugo Vickers from the Royal Collection Trust, whose work on the British royal family examines 20th century royal life, Peter Townsend was intelligent, charming, devoted to royal service, and by all accounts a genuinely good man who loved Margaret deeply and honourably. Margaret and Peter's friendship developed slowly over years, with Margaret gradually falling in love as she grew from teenager to young woman, and Peter, despite being 16 years older and married, finding himself drawn to the princess's spirit and warmth. But Peter was married, and in the 1940s and early 1950s, according to Professor Vickers, divorce carried enormous social stigma, particularly within the Church of England, of which Margaret's sister would become supreme governor when she became queen. Peter and his wife divorced in 1952, with Peter as the so-called innocent party, his wife having committed adultery. In the rigid morality of the time, this should have made Peter more acceptable as a potential spouse, but the fact remained that he was a divorced man, and the Church of England officially prohibited divorced people from remarrying in church while their former spouses still lived. According to Professor Vickers, this created an impossible situation for Margaret. The man she loved was legally and morally available by secular standards, but religiously and dynastically unacceptable. In 1953, the year of Elizabeth II's coronation, Margaret and Peter's relationship became romantic. According to accounts analysed by Professor Edwards, Margaret was 22 years old, vibrant and in love, and she believed that surely her family and the establishment would allow her to marry the man she loved. After all, Peter was a distinguished war hero, a gentleman, a man who had served the royal family faithfully for years. But what Margaret didn't fully understand was that her marriage wasn't just a personal matter. Under the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, according to Professor Carolyn Harris, Margaret, as a member of the royal family under age 25, required the monarch's permission to marry, and her sister Elizabeth, as queen, was bound by the advice of her government. The British government, led by Prime Minister Winston Churchill, was firmly opposed to the marriage. According to research by Professor Philip Ziegler, whose biography of King Edward VIII examines the abdication crisis of 1936, the government and the church were still traumatized by Edward VIII's abdication to marry divorced American Wallis Simpson just 17 years earlier. They feared that allowing Margaret to marry a divorced man would set a dangerous precedent, would undermine the Church of England's teachings on the sanctity of marriage, and would damage the monarchy's moral authority. The establishment's position, according to Professor Ziegler, was that Margaret must choose. She could marry Peter Townsend, but only if she renounced her royal status, her place in the line of succession, her income from the civil list, and essentially her identity as a princess. Or she could remain a princess and give up the man she loved. For 2 years, according to Professor Edwards, Margaret agonized over this choice. She and Peter were separated, with Peter sent abroad to serve as heir attacher in Brussels, a transparent attempt to separate the couple and let the relationship die through distance and time. But absence only made their hearts grow fonder. They wrote letters, planned for a future together, held on to hope that somehow the impossible would become possible. Margaret consulted with religious advisors, with family members, with friends. She wanted to marry Peter. She loved him desperately, but she also loved her sister, didn't want to cause Elizabeth problems with the government and church, and couldn't quite bring herself to walk away from everything she had known as a royal princess. In October 1955, when Margaret was about to turn 25, and would no longer need her sister's permission to marry under the Royal Marriages Act, the crisis came to a head. According to documents analysed by Professor Vickers, the government made clear that if Margaret married Peter, Parliament would withdraw her royal income, and she would have to leave Britain for several years. The Church of England reiterated that it could not bless the marriage. Margaret's sister, while personally sympathetic, could not go against the advice of her government and church, and Margaret, after weeks of private anguish, made her choice. On the 31st of October 1955, Margaret released a statement to the press. According to the text analysed by Professor Edwards, she wrote, "I would like it to be known that I have decided not to marry Group Captain Peter Townsend. I have been aware that subject to my renouncing my rights of succession, it might have been possible for me to contract a civil marriage, but mindful of the Church's teaching that Christian marriage is indissoluble and conscious of my duty to the Commonwealth, I have resolved to put these considerations before any others." The statement was formal, dutiful, and utterly heartbreaking. Behind the careful words was a woman whose heart was breaking, who was sacrificing her personal happiness for duty and family. Peter Townsend, according to his later memoirs analysed by Professor Edwards, was devastated but accepted Margaret's decision with grace and dignity. He left royal service, eventually married a young Belgian woman who looked remarkably like Margaret, and lived a quiet life largely out of the public eye. Margaret, according to Professor Edwards, never fully recovered from the loss. She went on to marry photographer Anthony Armstrong Jones in 1960, a marriage that produced 2 children but was turbulent and ultimately ended in divorce in 1978, making Margaret the first senior royal to divorce since Henry VIII. Friends said that Margaret never forgot Peter, that she kept mementos of him, that she would become melancholy when his name was mentioned. When Peter Townsend died in 1995, according to accounts from people close to Margaret analysed by Professor Edwards, she was deeply affected, mourning not just the man but the life they might have had together if the world had been different. Margaret herself died in 2002 at age 71, her life marked by moments of joy, but also by a sense of what might have been, by the sacrifice she had made at 25 that shaped the rest of her life. According to Professor Vickers, Margaret and Peter's story became a symbol of the conflict between personal desire and royal duty, a reminder that even in the 20th century, royal birth came with costs that ordinary people never had to pay. What makes Margaret's story so important, according to Professor Carolyn Harris, is that it was conducted in full public view, with newspapers documenting every development, with millions of people around the world following the romance and mourning when it ended. Margaret and Peter's love affair was the first major royal romance to play out in the modern media age, and the public's investment in it showed how people projected their own hopes and dreams onto royal figures, how they wanted to believe that love could conquer, all even for a princess. When Margaret chose duty over love, according to Professor Harris, millions of hearts broke along with hers, and the fairy tale died a very public death. But before we continue with more stories of heartbreak, let me tell you about the context in which these royal love stories unfolded, because I need you to understand what marriage meant for royal women and why their personal feelings were considered so irrelevant. Royal marriages were dynastic alliances, political tools used to cement relationships between nations, to end wars, to secure successions, to unite kingdoms. According to research by Professor Clarissa Campbell-Orr from Anglia Ruskin University, whose work on queenship and royal marriage examines European royal courts, from the medieval period through the early 20th century, royal daughters were essentially diplomatic assets, their marriages arranged to serve their families and nations' interests with little or no regard for their personal preferences or happiness. A royal bride, according to Professor Campbell-Orr, was expected to be a virgin, to be obedient, to produce heirs preferably male, to support her husband regardless of his behaviour, to represent her adopted country with grace and dignity, and to never complain publicly about her lot in life. If her husband was cruel, unfaithful, or simply disagreeable, she was expected to endure it quietly. If she fell in love with someone other than her husband, she was expected to suppress those feelings entirely. Divorce was virtually unthinkable for royal women until the late 20th century, viewed as a scandal that brought shame on royal families and undermined monarchy's moral authority. This meant, according to Professor Campbell-Orr, that countless royal women throughout history lived in marriages that ranged from merely loveless to actively abusive, bound to men they didn't love, and sometimes actively disliked. forbidden from seeking happiness elsewhere, their personal feelings considered utterly irrelevant compared to dynastic duty. Some royal women found ways to endure these marriages with dignity. Some found companionship and even love outside their marriages, conducting discreet affairs that were tolerated as long as they remained private and produced no illegitimate children who could complicate successions. And some royal women broke under the strain, their lives marked by depression, illness, and sometimes tragedy. Now let me tell you about Princess Diana Spencer, later Diana, Princess of Wales, because her story is perhaps the most famous and most heartbreaking royal love story of the modern era, a tale of a young woman who entered what she thought was a fairy tale and found herself trapped in a nightmare, who longed for love and found only duty and despair. Diana was born on the 1st of July, 1961, into British aristocracy, the youngest daughter of Viscount Althorp. According to research by Professor Kate Williams from the University of Reading, whose work on royal women examines Diana's life and legacy, Diana had a difficult childhood marked by her parents' bitter divorce when she was 7, an experience that left her with lifelong insecurities and a deep longing for the stable, loving family life she had never had as a child. In 1977, when Diana was just 16, she met Prince Charles, heir to the British throne, who was dating her older sister Sarah. According to royal biographer Andrew Morton, whose book Diana, her true story was based on secret interviews with Diana herself. Diana remembered Charles from that first meeting as charming but remote, a man 12 years her senior who barely noticed the shy teenager. But 3 years later, in 1980, when Diana was 19 and Charles was 31, and under increasing pressure from his family and the media to marry and produce heirs, Charles began to court Diana seriously. Diana was by all accounts desperately in love. According to Morton's interviews with Diana, she saw Charles as her Prince Charming, the man who would give her the love and family she had always longed for. She was young, romantic, naive about the realities of royal life, and thrilled by the attention from the future king. Charles, according to Diana, was attentive during their courtship, making her feel special and chosen. When Charles proposed in February 1981, according to Diana's later accounts, she said yes immediately, overcome with happiness that this wonderful man wanted to marry her. But what Diana didn't know, according to research by Professor Tina Brown, whose biography of Diana examines her marriage and its breakdown, was that Charles was in love with someone else, and had been for years. Camilla Parker Bowles, a woman Charles had loved since the early 1970s, remained the centre of Charles's emotional life, even as he prepared to marry Diana. Camilla was married to Andrew Parker Bowles, a British Army officer, and was therefore considered unsuitable as a royal bride when Charles and she first fell in love. But Charles had never stopped loving Camilla, and according to multiple sources analysed by Professor Brown, Charles continued his relationship with Camilla even during his engagement to Diana and throughout his marriage. Diana discovered the truth gradually, according to Morton's account of her experiences. 2 weeks before the wedding, Diana found a bracelet that Charles had commissioned for Camilla, engraved with their nicknames for each other. Diana was devastated, wanted to call off the wedding, but was told by her sisters that it was too late, that her face was already on tea towels, that she couldn't back out now. The wedding took place on the 29th of July, 1981, watched by 750 million people worldwide, called the Wedding of the Century, a fairy tale spectacle. But Diana, according to her later accounts, walked down the aisle of St. Paul's Cathedral, knowing that Charles's heart belonged to another woman, that she was marrying into a situation where she would always be competing with a ghost, where she would never be first in her husband's affections. The marriage was a disaster almost from the start. According to Morton's account based on Diana's testimony, Charles was emotionally distant, dismissive of Diana's feelings, critical of her in ways that destroyed her fragile confidence. Diana struggled with bulimia, with depression, with feeling trapped in a role she had been utterly unprepared for. She was just 20 years old, thrust into the most intense media spotlight in the world, expected to perform royal duties flawlessly while her private life was crumbling. According to Professor Brown, Diana made several suicide attempts during the marriage, cries for help that Charles responded to with coldness, apparently telling her that she was embarrassing and that she should pull herself together. Diana gave birth to Prince William in 1982 and Prince Harry in 1984, fulfilling her primary duty of producing heirs. But the marriage continued to deteriorate. According to multiple sources analysed by Professor Williams, by the mid-1980s, Charles had resumed his affair with Camilla, spending nights away from home, talking to Camilla on the phone for hours, essentially treating Diana as an obligation rather than a wife. Diana, young and starved for affection, began to seek emotional connection elsewhere. She developed intense friendships with various men, relationships that may or may not have become physical, but that definitely provided her with the emotional support she wasn't getting from her husband. In 1992, according to Professor Brown, Diana secretly cooperated with Andrew Morton on his biography of her, using a friend as an intermediary to provide hours of tape-recorded testimony about her marriage, her eating disorder, her suicide attempts, and Charles's ongoing affair with Camilla. When the book was published in June 1992, it caused a sensation. Diana had broken the ultimate royal rule. She had told the truth about what went on behind palace walls. The royal family was furious. Charles's supporters attacked Diana as unstable and vindictive, but Diana had achieved her goal. The world now knew that the fairy tale marriage was a lie, that she was suffering, that Charles's heart had never been hers. The marriage formally ended in divorce in 1996. After years of increasingly public warfare that had included both Charles and Diana giving tell-all interviews. According to the divorce settlement analysed by Professor Harris, Diana lost her HRH title but retained her princess title and received a substantial financial settlement. More importantly, according to Professor Williams, Diana was free. For the first time since she was 19 years old, she could make her own choices about her life, could date men she actually wanted to be with, could find happiness on her own terms. Diana spent the last year of her life, according to accounts from friends analysed by Professor Brown, happier than she had been in years. She was dating Dodi Fayed, the son of Egyptian billionaire Mohammed Al Fayed, a relationship that was new and exciting and made her feel young and carefree. She was planning her future, thinking about moving to America, considering various philanthropic projects. She was 46 years old and finally free. And then, on the 31st of August 1997, Diana and Dodi died in a car crash in a Paris tunnel, chased by paparazzi, and the world mourned not just a princess, but a woman whose life had been marked by heartbreak and who had just begun to find happiness. What makes Diana's story so heartbreaking, according to Professor Williams, is the waste of it all. Diana was a woman with so much love to give, who wanted nothing more than to be loved for herself, who married a man who couldn't or wouldn't love her, who spent 15 years of her life trapped in a marriage where she was never going to be enough because she wasn't Camilla. Diana's story revealed the brutality that could exist even in modern royal marriages, the way a young woman could be used for her bloodline and her ability to produce heirs, and then discarded emotionally when she had served her purpose. When Charles married Camilla in 2005, 8 years after Diana's death, according to Professor Harris, it felt like a final insult to Diana's memory, confirmation that Charles could have had with Diana what he always had with Camilla, if only he had been willing to try. Let me tell you about Grand Duchess Olga Nikolaevna Vavnovaya, eldest daughter of Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, because her story represents a different kind of royal heartbreak. The tragedy of a young woman who lived through revolution and terror and found love only to have it torn away by history itself. Olga was born on the 15th of November 1895, the first child of Nicholas and Alexandra, and according to research by Helen Rappaport, whose work on the Romanov family examines the daughters' lives. Olga grew up in the extraordinarily sheltered and isolated world of the Russian imperial court, protected from reality, but also deprived of normal social interactions and experiences. Olga was intelligent, serious-minded and romantic. According to Rappaport's analysis of her diaries and letters, Olga dreamed of marrying for love rather than for dynastic reasons, and she hoped that her father would allow her this freedom. Nicholas and Alexandra were unusual among royal parents in that they had married for love themselves, and they wanted their daughters to have the same opportunity. According to correspondence analysed by Rappaport, Nicholas repeatedly turned down proposals for his daughters from various European princes, insisting that his daughters would only marry men they loved. During World War I, Olga and her younger sister Tatiana trained as nurses and worked in military hospitals, treating wounded soldiers, according to accounts from people who knew her analysed by Rappaport. It was during this time that Olga fell in love with an officer she met through her hospital work. Various sources identify him as either Pavel Voronov or Alexander Voronov, a wounded officer from a respected but not royal family. Olga's feelings were deep and genuine. She talked about him in her diary, looked forward to his visits, dreamed about a future with him. But in early 1917, revolution swept Russia. The Romanov dynasty, which had ruled Russia for over 300 years, collapsed within days. Tsar Nicholas II abdicated in March 1917, and the imperial family was placed under house arrest. According to Rappaport, Olga's dreams of marrying her officer died with the abdication. In the chaos of revolution, there was no possibility of organising a wedding, no way for Olga to leave her family, no future to plan for. The family was moved from palace to palace, their circumstances becoming progressively more restricted and more dangerous as the Bolsheviks consolidated power. In July 1918, the imperial family was being held in the Ipatiev house in Ekaterinburg, a city in the Ural Mountains. Olga was 22 years old. According to testimony from guards and others analysed by Rappaport, Olga remained devoted to her family during their captivity, tutoring her younger sisters, reading to her haemophiliac brother Alexei, trying to keep up everyone's spirits, despite the increasingly obvious danger they faced. She still thought about the officer she had loved, according to her diary entries from this period analysed by Rappaport. But she knew she would never see him again, that whatever future she might have had died with the monarchy. On the night of the 16th of July -17, 1918, Bolshevik revolutionaries executed the entire imperial family in the basement of the Ipatiev house. Olga was murdered along with her parents, her 4 siblings, and several family servants. She was 22 years old, had lived through the collapse of everything she had known, had lost her chance at the love and family life she had dreamed of, and died in a basement in the middle of the night, shot multiple times, her body bayoneted to ensure death, then stripped and dumped in a mineshaft. According to Rappaport, Olga's diary, which survived the execution and was taken by one of the killers, reveals a young woman who remained hopeful and loving even as her world disintegrated around her, who dreamed of ordinary happiness, but was denied it by the accident of her birth into a dynasty that history had destroyed Dinah's. What makes Olga's story so heartbreaking, according to Rappaport, is how close she came to having a normal life. If the revolution had happened a few years later, Olga might have already been married and living away from the imperial court, might have survived the revolution because she wouldn't have been with her family when they were arrested. If her father had remained Tsar, Olga would have been allowed to marry her officer, would have had the love match she dreamed of. But history intervened, and Olga became a victim not just of revolution but of timing, denied happiness by forces entirely beyond her control. Now, let me tell you about Elizabeth of Bavaria, known as Sissis, who became Empress of Austria and Queen of Hungary, because her story shows how a royal marriage could trap a free-spirited woman and slowly destroy her over decades. Elizabeth was born on the 24th of December, 1837 in Munich, the daughter of Duke Maximilian Joseph in Bavaria, according to research by Brigitte Hamann, whose definitive biography of Elizabeth examines her life and psyche. Elizabeth grew up in a relatively relaxed aristocratic household where she was allowed considerable freedom, where she rode horses, wrote poetry, and dreamed romantic dreams about her future. In August 1853, Elizabeth's mother took her and her older sister Helene to Bad Ischl, where Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria was expected to propose to Helene, making her the future empress. The meeting was carefully orchestrated by Elizabeth's mother and Franz Joseph's mother, Archduchess Sophie, who were sisters and had long planned this dynastic alliance. But when the emperor met the two sisters, according to accounts analysed by Hamann, he ignored the sister he was supposed to choose and became instantly infatuated with 15-year-old Elizabeth. She was beautiful, shy, and utterly unprepared for the role of empress. But Franz Joseph was determined to marry her and only her. Elizabeth was swept off her feet by the emperor's attention. According to her later writings analysed by Hamann, she was just a teenager, had never imagined becoming empress, and was overwhelmed by Franz Joseph's devotion to her. When he proposed just days after meeting her, Elizabeth said yes, apparently believing that she was entering a romantic fairy tale. They married on the 24th of April, 1854, when Elizabeth was 16 years old and Franz Joseph was 23. The wedding was spectacular, and Elizabeth became one of the most powerful women in Europe overnight. But the reality of her position, according to Hamann, was nothing like the fairy tale Elizabeth had imagined. She was now subject to the rigid etiquette of the Austrian court, one of the most formal and traditional courts in Europe. Her mother-in-law Sophie controlled every aspect of Elizabeth's life, from what she wore to how she spent her time to, most painfully, how she raised her children. When Elizabeth gave birth to her first two children, daughters Sophie and Gisela, Archduchess Sophie essentially took the babies away from Elizabeth, insisting that she knew better how to raise future members of the imperial family. Elizabeth was expected to produce more children, preferably sons, while Sophie raised the daughters Elizabeth had given birth to. Elizabeth, according to her letters and diaries analysed by Hamann, was miserable. She felt trapped, controlled, infantilized. Her romantic dreams of marriage had been shattered by the reality of court life and her domineering mother-in-law. Franz Joseph loved Elizabeth, but he sided with his mother in conflicts, unable to stand up for his wife against the woman who had raised him and who he believed understood imperial protocol better than his young bride. Elizabeth developed psychosomatic illnesses, spent months away from Vienna supposedly recovering her health, but really escaping the suffocating court. In 1857, Elizabeth gave birth to a son, Crown Prince Rudolf, finally producing the male heir that secured the succession. But even Rudolf was taken from Elizabeth and given to Sophie to raise. Elizabeth, according to Hamann, felt that she had nothing, that she was merely a breeding machine in a gilded cage. When Sophie and Gisela, Elizabeth's two eldest daughters, accompanied her on a trip to Hungary in 1857, both children fell ill. Sophie died at age 2, and Elizabeth, according to her writings analysed by Hamann, blamed herself and was blamed by others for the child's death, even though it was Sophie who had insisted on bringing the children on an arduous journey. The death of her daughter sent Elizabeth into a profound depression that she never fully recovered from. Over the following decades, Elizabeth essentially withdrew from court life and from her marriage. She travelled constantly, spending months or years away from Vienna, wandering around Europe and the Mediterranean, writing melancholy poetry about death and freedom, becoming obsessed with maintaining her beauty and her famously tiny waist. According to Hamann, Elizabeth underwent punishing exercise routines, starved herself to maintain her weight, and spent hours each day on her hair care and beauty treatments, controlling her body in the only way she was allowed to control anything in her life. Franz Joseph and Elizabeth's marriage survived in form but not in substance. They wrote letters to each other when apart, maintained courtesy and respect, but the passion and romance of their early days had long since died. Franz Joseph took a mistress, the actress Katharina Schratt, a relationship that Elizabeth apparently accepted or perhaps welcomed, since it took pressure off her to fulfill wifely duties she had no interest in. Elizabeth developed intense friendships with various people, relationships that may or may not have been romantic, but that definitely provided her with emotional sustenance that her marriage didn't. In 1889, tragedy struck again. Crown Prince Rudolf, Elizabeth and Franz Joseph's only son and heir to the throne, died in an apparent murder, suicide at his hunting lodge, mailing, shooting his teenage mistress, and then himself. The scandal rocked Europe. Elizabeth was devastated, according to accounts analysed by Hamann, not just by Rudolf's death, but by the realisation of how unhappy he had been, how the weight of imperial expectations had crushed him just as they had crushed her. After Rudolf's death, Elizabeth wore only black for the rest of her life, adopted a fatalistic attitude toward life and death, and became even more reclusive. On the 10th of September 1898, while travelling in Geneva, Elizabeth was assassinated by an Italian anarchist named Luigi Lucchini, who stabbed her through the heart with a sharpened file. She was 60 years old. According to Hamann's analysis, Elizabeth's death was almost a relief to her, an escape from a life that had brought her little happiness after her teenage years. Franz Joseph mourned her deeply, according to accounts, and reportedly said that she would never know how much he had loved her. But the tragedy, according to Hamann, is that Elizabeth had needed more than Franz Joseph's love. She had needed freedom, autonomy, the ability to live her life on her own terms, and those were things her position as empress would never allow her to have. What makes Elizabeth's story so heartbreaking, according to Hamann, is the long, slow suffocation of it. Elizabeth wasn't forced into an obviously terrible marriage. Franz Joseph genuinely loved her for their entire lives. But love alone wasn't enough when Elizabeth's role as empress demanded she give up her freedom, her children, her sense of self. Elizabeth's tragedy was that she spent 60 years trapped in a position she never wanted, married to a man she had once loved, but who couldn't protect her from the demands of the court and the empire, and she spent those 6 decades essentially in mourning for the free, happy girl she had been before she became empress. Let me tell you about Princess Charlotte of Belgium, whose love story ended in one of the most famous tragedies in royal history, a tale of ambition, betrayal, and madness that shocked the world in the 1860s. Charlotte was born on the 7th of June, 1840, the daughter of King Leopold I of Belgium, and according to research by Joan Haslip, whose biography of Charlotte examines her life, Charlotte was exceptionally intelligent, politically astute, and ambitious, raised by a father who educated her in statecraft and encouraged her to think beyond the traditional limitations placed on royal women. In 1857, Charlotte married Archduke Maximilian of Austria, younger brother of Emperor Franz Joseph. According to Haslip's analysis, Charlotte and Maximilian seemed well matched. They were both intelligent, cultured, interested in liberal politics and social reform. Maximilian was handsome and charming, though according to later evidence analysed by Haslip, he was also a serial womanizer who had affairs throughout his marriage and may have infected Charlotte with a sexually transmitted disease that left her unable to have children, a devastating blow to a royal couple whose primary duty was to produce heirs. For several years, Charlotte and Maximilian lived in Trieste and then in Milan, where Maximilian served as governor of Lombardy Venetia. But Maximilian's liberal policies were unpopular with the Austrian government, and he was recalled in 1859. According to Haslip, Charlotte and Maximilian then lived in semi-retirement at their castle Miramare near Trieste, comfortable but frustrated, feeling that Maximilian's talents were being wasted. They wanted a kingdom of their own, a place where they could implement their progressive ideas and make their mark on history. In 1863, representatives of Mexican conservatives approached Maximilian with an offer, the throne of Mexico. Mexico had been in turmoil for decades, and conservatives wanted a European prince to bring stability and legitimacy. The offer was supported by French Emperor Napoleon III, who had his own imperial ambitions in Mexico and wanted a friendly monarch there. According to her slip, Charlotte was the driving force behind accepting the offer. She was ambitious, wanted to be more than just an archduke's wife, and believed that she and Maximilian could bring civilization and progress to Mexico. In 1864, Charlotte and Maximilian travelled to Mexico and were crowned Emperor and Empress of Mexico. But the empire was a disaster from the start. According to research by historian M. McCallan, whose work on Charlotte examines her time in Mexico, Mexico was torn by civil war between conservatives who supported Maximilian and Republicans who supported Benito Juárez as the legitimate president. Large parts of the country rejected Maximilian's rule entirely. The French military support that was supposed to secure the empire was inadequate, and Maximilian and Charlotte found themselves ruling a nation that didn't want them, imposing a monarchy on people who had fought to establish a republic. Charlotte threw herself into the role, according to McCallan. She served as regent when Maximilian travelled, made political decisions, tried to implement reforms, and believed that their rule could still succeed if they just worked hard enough. But by 1866 the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Napoleon III, facing problems in Europe, announced that he was withdrawing French military support from Mexico. Without French troops, Maximilian's government was doomed. Charlotte made the desperate decision to travel to Europe herself to beg Napoleon III and Pope Pius VI to continue supporting the Mexican Empire. According to Haslip's analysis of Charlotte's correspondence and the accounts of people who saw her during this period, Charlotte's mental state was deteriorating under the stress. She was 26 years old, had been empress of a collapsing empire for 2 years, was watching her dreams and ambitions crumble, and was perhaps beginning to realise that she and Maximilian had been used as pawns in Napoleon III's imperial games. When Napoleon III refused to continue supporting Mexico, Charlotte had a mental breakdown. She became paranoid, believed people were trying to poison her, suffered hallucinations and delusions. Charlotte's mental collapse worsened rapidly. According to accounts analysed by Haslip, she wandered around Rome believing that assassins were pursuing her, sought refuge at the Vatican, and begged the Pope to protect her. She was eventually returned to her family in Belgium in a state of complete madness. She was diagnosed with what was then called imperial madness, what would probably now be recognised as schizophrenia, possibly triggered or worsened by syphilis contracted from her husband. Charlotte would spend the rest of her life in mental institutions and in the care of family members, never recovering her sanity. Meanwhile, in Mexico, Maximilian refused to abandon his throne despite the hopeless military situation. According to McCallan, Maximilian perhaps believed he could still salvage something from the disaster, or perhaps he felt that abandoning Mexico would be dishonourable. He stayed, and in 1867, Republican forces captured him. He was caught, marshalled, and executed by firing squad on the 19th of June, 1867. He was 34 years old. His last words reportedly included messages of love for Charlotte, whom he would never see again. Charlotte lived in madness for 60 more years, dying in 1927 at age 86. According to Haslip, for those 6 decades, Charlotte apparently never fully understood what had happened, sometimes believing she was still Empress of Mexico, sometimes asking when Maximilian would return, trapped in a mental world that included fragments of her brief imperial glory mixed with delusions and paranoia. Her family protected her, maintained her in comfort, but could not restore her sanity or give her back the life she had lost when her Mexican dream collapsed. What makes Charlotte's story so heartbreaking, according to Haslip, is the waste and tragedy of it all. Charlotte was brilliant, capable, ambitious, and she channeled all that ambition into a doomed enterprise that destroyed her. Her mental breakdown robbed her of everything: her husband, her empire, her sanity, leaving her trapped for 60 years in a mental prison while the world moved on without her. Charlotte's tragedy shows the dangers that came with royal ambition. the price that could be paid when personal and political dreams collided with brutal reality. Now let me tell you about Marie Antoinette, because even though her story is famous, the full tragedy of her love life and marriage is often misunderstood. Marie Antoinette was born Maria Antonia Josepha Johanna on the 2nd of November 1755 in Vienna, the 15th child of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria. According to research by Antonia Fraser, whose definitive biography of Marie Antoinette examines every aspect of her life, Marie Antoinette was a pawn in her mother's diplomatic schemes from childhood, raised to be charming and marriageable so she could be used to cement an alliance between Austria and France, two nations that had been enemies for centuries. In 1770, at age 14, Marie Antoinette was married to the Dauphin Louis Auguste, heir to the French throne and future King Louis XVI. According to Fraser's analysis, Marie Antoinette left everything she knew in Austria and travelled to France to marry a boy she had never met, knowing she would probably never see her mother or her homeland again. The marriage, according to Fraser, was a disaster from the start. Louis Auguste was shy, awkward, and apparently suffered from a physical condition that made sexual intercourse painful or impossible for him. For 7 years, the marriage remained unconsummated, a source of enormous stress for Marie Antoinette, who was blamed for the failure to produce heirs and subjected to humiliating examinations and public discussion of her fertility and her marriage bed. Marie Antoinette, according to Fraser, was just a teenage girl trapped in a foreign country where she was viewed with suspicion because of her Austrian background, married to a husband who couldn't or wouldn't consummate their marriage, subjected to intense pressure to produce heirs, and desperately lonely. She dealt with her unhappiness by throwing herself into the pleasures of court life, gambling, fashion, parties, spending money extravagantly on clothes and jewels, and redecorating palaces. According to Fraser, this behaviour was criticised harshly, with Marie Antoinette portrayed as frivolous and wasteful, but she was really just a young woman trying to find happiness and distraction from a marriage that brought her no joy. In 1777, 7 years into the marriage, Marie Antoinette's brother Joseph II visited France, and apparently had a frank talk with Louis about his marital duties. Shortly after, according to Fraser, the marriage was finally consummated, and Marie Antoinette became pregnant. She eventually bore 4 children between 1778 and 1786, finally fulfilling her primary duty as queen. But by this time, according to Fraser, Marie Antoinette's reputation had been destroyed by years of scandal and gossip, much of it malicious and false, that portrayed her as everything from a frivolous spendthrift to an adulteress too, most infamously in the diamond necklace affair, a criminal. The reality, according to Fraser's careful analysis of the evidence, was that Marie Antoinette was far less scandalous than her reputation suggested. She did have intense emotional friendships, particularly with the Swedish Count Axel von Fersen, who may have been the love of her life. According to Fraser, Fersen loved Marie Antoinette devotedly, and she returned his feelings. But whether their relationship ever became physical remains uncertain. The surviving correspondence between them, analysed by Fraser, suggests deep emotional intimacy, but is ambiguous about physical intimacy. What is clear is that Fersen was the great romance of Marie Antoinette's life, the man who understood her, who she could be herself with, who loved her not as a queen, but as a woman. When the French Revolution came in 1789, Marie Antoinette's world collapsed. The royal family was forced to leave Versailles and live as virtual prisoners in Paris. According to Fraser, Fersen remained devoted to Marie Antoinette throughout the Revolution, organising the ill-fated flight to Varennes in 1791 that was meant to help the royal family escape France, but instead led to their capture and contributed to Louis VI's eventual execution. After Louis was guillotined in January 1793, Marie Antoinette was imprisoned in the Temple and then in the Conciergerie, subjected to a show trial where she was accused of crimes including incest with her young son, and sentenced to death. On the 16th of October 1793, Marie Antoinette was guillotined in Paris. She was 37 years old. According to accounts analysed by Fraser, she maintained her dignity to the end, apologising when she accidentally stepped on her executioner's foot, taking courage from the thought that she would soon be reunited with Louis. But, according to Fraser, Marie Antoinette's last thoughts may well have included Fersen, the man who had loved her truly and whom she had loved, the man who represented the personal happiness she had never been allowed to fully embrace because of her position as queen. Fersen, according to Fraser, mourned Marie Antoinette for the rest of his life, never marrying, wearing a ring with a hair in it, and dying in 1810, killed by a mob in Stockholm who blamed him for various political scandals. What makes Marie Antoinette's story so heartbreaking, according to Fraser, is the tragedy of a woman who was never allowed to be a person, who was always a symbol, a pawn, a queen, everything except herself. She was married at 14 to a boy who didn't love her, expected to produce heirs in a marriage bed that brought her no pleasure, blamed for political and economic crises that had nothing to do with her, demonized by revolutionaries who needed a villain, and executed for being what she had been raised to be. In all of this, her one real happiness, her love for Fersen, had to remain largely hidden, expressed in coded letters and stolen moments, never allowed full expression, because she was the queen and he was not the king. Let me tell you about Princess Victoria Melita of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, known in her family as Ducky, whose story shows how even in the early 20th century, royal women could still be forced to sacrifice love for duty, and how such sacrifices could destroy multiple lives. Victoria Melita was born on the 25th of November 1876, in Malta, the granddaughter of Queen Victoria of England. According to research by Karine Hall, whose biography of Victoria Melita examines her tumultuous life, Ducky grew up in a cosmopolitan royal environment, strong-willed and artistic, and fell in love as a teenager with her first cousin, Grand Duke Kirill Vladimirovich of Russia. But Ducky's grandmother, Queen Victoria, had other plans. According to Hall, Victoria had decided that Ducky should marry another first cousin, Ernest Louis, Grand Duke of Hesse, Victoria's own grandson through her daughter Alice. The marriage would unite two branches of Victoria's family and secure the succession in Hesse. Ducky and Ernest Louis were not in love, were in fact quite incompatible, but family pressure was enormous. Queen Victoria personally pressured Ducky to accept the match, according to Hall, making clear that refusing would be seen as betrayal of family duty. In 1894, Ducky married Ernest Louis despite her deep reluctance. According to Hall's analysis of letters and diaries from people close to the couple, the marriage was unhappy from the start. Ducky and Ernest Louis had nothing in common, didn't enjoy each other's company, and had fundamental incompatibilities. Ernest Louis was rumoured to be homosexual, something his family denied, but that several historians have suggested as explanation for his lack of interest in his wife. Ducky, according to Hall, tried to make the marriage work, bore a daughter in 1895, and attempted to fulfill her duties as Grand Duchess of Hesse, but she was miserable, and Ernest Louis was no happier. By 1901, 7 years into the marriage, it was clear to everyone that the marriage was a failure. Queen Victoria had died that year, removing one source of pressure to maintain the marriage. Ducky and Ernest Louis agreed to divorce, a shocking decision for royalty at the time. According to Hall, the divorce was finalised in 1901, with their daughter Elizabeth remaining in her father's custody. The divorce caused scandal across royal Europe, with Ducky's family largely blaming her for the failure of the marriage and for the shame of the divorce. Ducky was finally free to marry Kirill, the man she had loved all along, but more obstacles appeared. Kirill was a first cousin, just as Ernest Louis had been, and the Russian Orthodox Church initially refused to allow the marriage because of the close blood relationship. Tsar Nicholas II, Kirill's cousin, also opposed the marriage and threatened to strip Kirill of his titles and position if he married Ducky. But Kirill and Ducky, according to Hall, were determined. They married in October 1905 in a quiet ceremony, and Nicholas II followed through on his threat, stripping Kirill of his titles and banishing him from Russia. For several years, Kirill and Ducky lived in exile from Russia, moving around Europe, struggling financially without Kirill's imperial allowance. But according to Hall, they were happy together in a way that Ducky had never been happy with Ernest Louis. They were a true love match, devoted to each other, and Ducky bore 3 children between 1906 and 1914. Eventually, in 1908, Nicholas II relented and restored Kirill's titles and position, allowing the family to return to Russia. But then came World War I and the Russian Revolution. Kirill and Ducky were living in Russia when revolution broke out in 1917. According to Hall, they managed to escape to Finland and eventually made their way to Paris, living in exile as the Bolsheviks executed Kirill's relatives and destroyed the Russia they had known. Kirill eventually declared himself emperor in exile, a title the surviving Romanovs disputed, and that meant nothing in practical terms, but that gave Kirill and Ducky a sense of purpose and identity. The tragedy of Ducky and Kirill's love story, according to Hall, is that by the time they were finally allowed to be together, their world had been destroyed. Ducky had sacrificed years of her life to a loveless marriage because of family pressure, had been separated from her first daughter who died in 1903 at age 8, had endured exile and scandal to marry the man she loved, and then had watched that man's entire world, the Russia he was born to serve, disappear in revolution and bloodshed. Ducky and Kirill lived the rest of their lives in exile in France, supported by the charity of wealthier relatives, Kirill dying in 1938 and Ducky in 1936, both still clinging to titles and positions that no longer meant anything outside their own imaginations. What makes Ducky's story heartbreaking, according to Hall, is the years she lost to duty and the price she paid for love. If Ducky had been allowed to marry Kirill in the first place, they might have lived their entire lives in Russia as respected members of the imperial family, their children growing up in palaces rather than exile. Instead, Ducky's grandmother's insistence on a dynastic marriage cost Ducky years of happiness and eventually contributed to the larger tragedy of the Russian imperial family's destruction. Now let me tell you about Crown Princess Martha of Norway, whose love story was complicated by duty and war, a tale of a woman who loved 2 men and whose choices were shaped by the catastrophic events of World War II. Martha was born on the 28th of March, 1901, in Stockholm, Sweden, a princess of the Swedish royal family. According to research by Tor Bowman Larsen, whose biography of Martha examines her life, Martha grew up in the twilight of the Edwardian era, educated, cultured, and aware of her duty to make an advantageous royal marriage. According to Bowman Larsen, Martha fell in love as a young woman with a Swedish count, a man who was aristocratic but not royal, and therefore not considered suitable as a husband for a princess destined to make a dynastic marriage. Martha's family discouraged the relationship, and Martha, like so many royal women before her, accepted that personal preference had to give way to duty. In 1929, Martha married her second cousin, Prince Olav of Norway, heir to the Norwegian throne. According to Bowman Larsen, Martha and Olav's marriage was arranged but not unhappy. They respected each other, had 3 children, and Martha grew into her role as Crown Princess of Norway. But then came April 1940, when Nazi Germany invaded Norway. King Håkon III and Crown Prince Olav refused to surrender, and the royal family fled, eventually making their way to England and then to the United States. According to Bowman Larsen, Martha and her children settled in Washington, D.C., while Olav remained in England with Norwegian forces in exile. Martha became a symbol of Norwegian resistance, gave speeches, raised funds for Norwegian relief, and became personally close to President Franklin D. Roosevelt and his family. According to research by presidential historian Hazel Rowley, whose work on Roosevelt examines his relationships, Roosevelt and Martha developed an intense and possibly romantic friendship during the war years. They spent considerable time together, with Martha frequently visiting Roosevelt at the White House and at his retreat in Hyde Park. Roosevelt, who was himself in a complicated marriage to Eleanor Roosevelt, apparently found in Martha companionship and emotional support. Martha, separated from her husband for years by the war, found in Roosevelt a powerful ally for Norwegian causes, and perhaps more. The exact nature of Roosevelt and Martha's relationship remains debated by historians. According to Rowley's analysis of surviving correspondence and accounts from people who observed them, the relationship was at minimum an intense emotional friendship and possibly a romantic affair, though whether it became physical is unknown and probably unprovable. What is clear, according to Rowley, is that Roosevelt cared deeply for Martha, supported her and her children throughout the war, and that Martha valued Roosevelt's friendship and support immensely. Roosevelt died suddenly in April 1945, just weeks before Germany's surrender. According to accounts analysed by Bowman, Larson, Martha was devastated, mourning both a friend and an ally, and perhaps the man she had fallen in love with. After the war, Martha returned to Norway with her children and resumed her life as Crown Princess. Olav succeeded to the throne in 1957 as King Olav V, and Martha served as Queen Consort, performing royal duties and raising her children. But according to Bowman Larson, Martha never forgot Roosevelt, and friends reported that she would become melancholy when his name was mentioned. Martha died of cancer on the 5th of April, 1954, at age 52, before Olav became king. According to Bowman Larson, her short life had been shaped by duty, by war, by impossible choices between personal feelings and royal obligations. She had married the man her family chose rather than the man she loved as a girl. She had found connection and possibly love with Roosevelt during the war years when circumstances separated her from her husband. She had returned to duty and convention after the war, living out her life as the proper crown princess, even if her heart belonged elsewhere. What makes Martha's story poignant, according to Bowman Larson, is the way historical events intervened in her personal life. The war that separated Martha from her husband also gave her years of freedom and possibility, time with Roosevelt that she might never have had otherwise. But when the war ended, duty reasserted itself, and Martha returned to the life she had been born to live, whatever her personal feelings might have been. Her story shows how even in the mid-20th century, royal women's lives and loves were still shaped and constrained by duty and expectation. Let me tell you about Princess Stephanie of Monaco, daughter of Prince Rainier III and Princess Grace, because her story shows that even royal women born in the late 20th century, in an era when women's freedoms had greatly expanded, still faced unique challenges when it came to love and marriage. Stephanie was born on the 1st of February 1965, the youngest child of Monaco's ruling family. According to research by Wendy Lay, whose biography of Grace Kelly examines the Monaco royal family, Stephanie grew up in the glare of international media attention, her every move scrutinized, her relationships subjected to intense public interest. In September 1982, when Stephanie was just 17, she was in the car when her mother Grace suffered a stroke while driving, causing an accident that killed Grace and severely injured Stephanie. According to Lay's account, Stephanie was traumatized by her mother's death and by the fact that she had been unable to save her. In the years following Grace's death, according to Lay, Stephanie became rebellious, rejecting the constraints of royal life, pursuing a career as a fashion designer and pop singer, and engaging in a series of relationships that shocked Monaco's conservative establishment and her father. Stephanie dated circus performers, bodyguards, race car drivers, men her father considered utterly unsuitable for a princess. According to Lay, Stephanie was seeking authenticity, trying to find love on her own terms, rather than the dynastic matches her father wanted to arrange. In 1995, Stephanie married her bodyguard Daniel Ducruet in a civil ceremony, shocking royal watchers. The marriage produced 2 children, but ended in divorce less than 2 years later after Ducruet was photographed in compromising positions with another woman. In 2003, Stephanie entered into a relationship with elephant trainer Franco Ni, and moved with her children to his circus. According to media accounts analysed by Lay, Stephanie was genuinely in love with the circus lifestyle, finding freedom and adventure away from Monaco's constraints. But the relationship ended in scandal when allegations surfaced about Nye's treatment of circus animals. Stephanie returned to Monaco, her romantic dreams again ending in disappointment. According to Lay, Stephanie's romantic life has been marked by a pattern of falling for men outside the traditional royal sphere, seeking authentic connection rather than advantageous matches, and having those relationships end badly, either because the men couldn't handle the pressure of being involved with a princess, or because they turned out to be less honourable than Stephanie had believed. As of recent years, Stephanie has focused on her children and her charitable work, particularly with HIV-AIDS, and has apparently accepted that finding lasting romantic happiness may not be in the cards for her. What makes Stephanie's story significant, according to Lay, is that even in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, even in a tiny principality that depends on tourism and celebrity rather than traditional royal power, a princess still faced enormous difficulties in finding love. Stephanie had more freedom than her ancestors had, could divorce, could have relationships outside marriage, could choose her own partners. But that freedom came with its own problems. The media scrutiny, the unsuitable men attracted to her fame rather than herself, the difficulty of knowing whether someone loved her or loved being with a princess. Let me tell you about more of these heartbreaking love stories, because the pattern repeats across centuries and continents. Royal women trapped between love and duty, their hearts breaking while they maintained perfect composure for the world to see. Now, let me tell you about Princess Louise of Belgium, whose love story was scandalous, even by royal standards, a tale of forbidden passion that destroyed her reputation and nearly destroyed her life. Louise was born on the 18th of February, 1858, the eldest daughter of King Leopold II of Belgium, the monarch whose brutal exploitation of the Congo made him one of history's most controversial rulers. According to research by Theo Aronson, whose work on royal scandals examines Louise's life, she grew up in a dysfunctional royal household, with a cruel father who seemed incapable of affection, and a mother who withdrew from family life as much as protocol allowed. In 1875, at age 17, Louise was married to Prince Philip of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, a cousin, and a match arranged entirely for dynastic reasons. According to Aronson, Louise and Philip were mismatched from the start. Philip was conventional, proper, and boring. Louise was passionate, impulsive, and hungry for excitement that her marriage utterly failed to provide. The couple had 2 children, but the marriage was loveless, and Louise, according to accounts analysed by Aronson, was desperately unhappy, trapped in a gilded cage in Vienna where she was expected to be a proper Austrian princess, despite her Belgian upbringing and her rebellious temperament. In the 1890s, Louise began an affair with a Croatian officer named Gordza Matacic. According to Aronson's analysis of the scandal that followed, Louise fell passionately, recklessly in love with Matacic, a man who was handsome, adventurous, and everything her stuffy husband was not. Their affair became increasingly obvious and increasingly reckless. Louise spent money extravagantly on Matacic, gave him expensive gifts, made no attempt to hide her feelings for him. Vienna society was shocked. Her husband was humiliated. Her father, Leopold II, was enraged at the scandal Louise was causing. In 1902, Louise made the extraordinary decision to leave her husband and run away with Matacic. According to Aronson, they fled to Paris together, causing one of the biggest royal scandals of the era. Leopold II was apoplectic with rage. He demanded that French authorities arrest Matacic, accusing him of forging Louise's signature on documents related to financial transactions. Matacic was arrested, tried, and sentenced to prison for forgery, charges that Aronson suggests were questionable at best and politically motivated at worst. Louise, according to Aronson, was declared insane by her family, a convenient diagnosis that allowed her father and husband to have her committed to an insane asylum against her will. For 4 years, from 1902 to 1906, Louise was held in asylums in Austria and Germany, diagnosed with erotomania and moral insanity. Victorian-era diagnoses that essentially meant a woman who refused to accept her proper role and who insisted on following her sexual and emotional desires. According to accounts from asylum staff analysed by Aronson, Louise was not actually insane. She was angry, rebellious, and desperately in love with Matačić, but she showed no signs of actual mental illness. The asylum confinement was punishment for her refusal to be a proper princess. Louise was released in 1906 after a campaign by supporters who argued that her confinement was illegal and unjust. She immediately went back to Matačić, who had been released from prison. According to Aronson, Louise and Matačić lived together for many years, never able to marry because Louise's husband refused to divorce her, but devoted to each other despite the scandals and hardships they had endured. Louise was completely estranged from her family, lived in relative poverty compared to her royal upbringing, and was shunned by European high society. But according to her later writings analysed by Aronson, she insisted she had no regrets, that her years with Matačić were worth more than any amount of royal privilege. Louise died in 1924 at age 66, having spent the last 2 decades of her life with Matačić, ostracised from her family and society, but, according to Aronson, happier than she had ever been in her royal marriage. Matačić died in 1923, and Louise mourned him deeply. According to Aronson, Louise's story was both a tragedy and a triumph. A tragedy because of what she had to sacrifice for love, the decades of persecution and imprisonment, the estrangement from her children, but also a triumph because she had chosen love over duty, had refused to be broken by the forces arrayed against her, and had lived according to her own desires rather than others' expectations. What makes Louise's story both heartbreaking and inspiring, according to Aronson, is her refusal to conform. Most royal women in her position would have stayed in their loveless marriages, taken discreet lovers perhaps, but maintained the fire-dade of propriety. Louise refused. She chose passion over propriety, love over luxury, and she paid an enormous price for that choice, but never regretted it. Her story shows both the terrible price of defying royal expectations and the possibility of surviving that defiance, of finding happiness even when the entire world seemed determined to prevent it. Let me tell you about Empress Alexandra Feodorovna of Russia, born Princess Alix of Hesse, whose great love story had a tragic ending that shocked the world. Alix was born on the 6th of June, 1872, the 6th child of Grand Duke Louis IV of Hesse and Princess Alice of the United Kingdom, according to research by Robert K. Massey, whose book Nicholas and Alexandra examines their lives and reign. Alix grew up with tragedy shadowing her family. Her younger brother died at age 2 when she was 6. Her mother Alice died when Alix was 6, nursing Alix and her siblings through diphtheria. These early losses, according to Massey, shaped Alix into a serious, anxious, deeply religious woman who craved stability and love. In 1889, when Alix was 16, she travelled to Russia for her sister Ella's wedding to Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich, uncle of Tsarevich Nicholas Alexandrovich, heir to the Russian throne. According to Massey, Nicholas and Alix met at the wedding celebrations and fell instantly in love. Nicholas was 21, Alix was 16, and by all accounts it was a genuine love match, the kind of romance that both had dreamed of. They wrote to each other after Alix returned to Germany, Nicholas declaring his love and his intention to marry her, but obstacles appeared immediately. Nicholas's parents, particularly his father Alexander III, opposed the match. According to Massey, Alexander III wanted Nicholas to marry a princess from a more important royal house, someone who would bring political advantages. Alix was from a minor German princely family, not a brilliant match for the heir to the Russian throne. More seriously, Alex was a Lutheran Protestant, and Orthodox church law required that the Tsarevich's wife convert to Orthodoxy. Alex, deeply religious, agonized over conversion, feeling it would be a betrayal of her Protestant faith and her mother's memory. For 5 years, Nicholas and Alex's relationship was in limbo, with Nicholas begging Alex to convert and marry him, and Alex torn between her love for Nicholas and her religious scruples. According to Massey, they saw each other occasionally at family gatherings, their love deepening, but seemingly impossible to fulfill. Then in 1894, Alexander III fell gravely ill with kidney disease. On his deathbed, realizing that Nicholas would soon be Tsar and needed to marry, Alexander III relented and gave his blessing to Nicholas's marriage to Alex. Alex finally agreed to convert to Orthodoxy, according to Massey, motivated both by her love for Nicholas and by the realization that refusing would mean losing him forever. She arrived in Russia in October 1894, was received into the Orthodox Church taking the name Alexandra Feodorovna, and Alexander III died just days later. Nicholas became Tsar Nicholas II at age 26, and he and Alexandra married on the 26th of November 1894, just 6 weeks after his father's death, with the court still in mourning. According to Massey, it was seen as an inauspicious beginning, with Alexandra arriving as the old Tsar died, and marrying amid mourning rather than celebration. But Nicholas and Alexandra were genuinely in love. According to Massey's analysis of their extensive correspondence, they adored each other, wrote passionate letters when separated, called each other pet names, and maintained a loving marriage even under the immense pressures of ruling Russia. They had 5 children between 1895 and 1904, 4 daughters, and finally a son, Alexei, born in 1904. According to Massey, Alexandra was devoted to Nicholas and her children, determined to be a good wife and mother and empress. But Alexandra's reign as empress was marked by tragedy and disaster from the start. She was shy, awkward in public, spoke Russian with a German accent, and was never popular with Russian society or the Russian people. According to Massey, Alexandra's personality, reserved and uncomfortable with the performative aspects of being empress, was poorly suited to her role. Russians compared her unfavourably to Nicholas's mother, the charming and socially adept Maria Feodorovna, and Alexandra was hurt by the criticism, but unable to change her nature. The greatest tragedy of Alexandra's life, according to Massey, was the discovery that Alexei suffered from haemophilia, a genetic blood disorder inherited from Alexandra's side of the family. Haemophilia meant that Alexei could bleed to death from minor injuries, and there was no cure or effective treatment in the early 20th century. Alexandra was devastated, guilt-ridden that she had passed this terrible disease to her beloved son, and terrified that Alexei would die in childhood, as so many haemophiliac boys did. According to Massey, Alexandra's entire life became focused on keeping Alexei alive, on protecting him from injury, on finding anyone who could help ease his suffering during bleeding episodes. This desperation led Alexandra to Grigory Rasputin, a Siberian peasant and self-proclaimed holy man who had a reputation for healing powers. According to Massey, Rasputin was able to help Alexei during hemorrhagic crises, possibly through hypnosis and calming presence that helped Alexei relax and allowed his blood to clot more effectively. Alexandra became convinced that Rasputin was sent by God to save her son, and she gave Rasputin enormous influence over her, and through her over Nicholas. Rasputin's influence became a massive scandal, with rumours that he was Alexandra's lover, that he controlled the imperial family, that he was leading Russia to disaster. According to Massey, these rumours were largely false, but the damage to the imperial family's reputation was enormous. When World War I came in 1914, Russia suffered catastrophic losses. Nicholas took personal command of the army in 1915, leaving Alexandra as de facto regent in Petrograd. According to Massey, Alexandra, advised by Rasputin, made a series of disastrous decisions, appointing and dismissing ministers seemingly at whim, making the government dysfunctional at the worst possible time. By late 1916, Russia was losing the war, the economy was collapsing, and the imperial family was more unpopular than ever. Rasputin was assassinated in December 1916 by nobles who saw him as a threat to the monarchy, and Alexandra mourned him as a saint and a martyr. In March 1917, revolution swept Russia. Nicholas abdicated, ending 300 years of Romanov rule. The imperial family was arrested and held under house arrest, first at their palace at Tsarskoye Selo, then in Siberia. According to Massey, Alexandra faced their captivity with dignity and faith, believing that God would protect them, that loyal Russians would rescue them. But no rescue came. In July 1918, the Bolsheviks decided that the imperial family was too dangerous to keep alive. On the night of the 16th of July, -17, 1918, in a basement in Ekaterinburg, Nicholas, Alexandra, their 5 children and several servants were shot and bayoneted to death. According to Massey's analysis of the execution accounts, Alexandra died trying to protect her daughters. Her last thoughts of her children, and perhaps of Nicholas, the man she had loved so completely, and who had loved her just as deeply. Their great love story had ended in a basement with gunfire and blood. 2 people who had done nothing worse than love each other, and their children paying the ultimate price for the accident of their birth and position. What makes Nicholas and Alexandra's story so heartbreaking, according to Massey, is the waste and tragedy of it all. They loved each other genuinely, deeply, faithfully. They were devoted parents, but they were completely unsuited to the roles history had assigned them, unable to navigate the political and social challenges of ruling a vast empire in crisis. And their love, which should have been their strength, became in some ways their weakness, blinding them to realities they needed to face, and making them vulnerable to manipulators like Rasputin. Their story shows that even the deepest love is not enough when history and duty demand more than love can provide. Now let me tell you about Catherine Howard, 5th wife of King Henry VIII of England, whose love story ended on a scaffold when she was barely out of her teens. Catherine was born around 1523, the daughter of Lord Edmund Howard, a younger son of the Duke of Norfolk. According to research by David Starkey, whose work on Henry VIII's wives examines Catherine's short life, Catherine grew up in relative poverty, despite her aristocratic connections, living in the crowded household of her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, receiving little education and less supervision. In the chaotic household at Lambeth, according to Starkey, Catherine began sexual relationships as a young teenager, first with her music teacher, Henry Manox, and then with Frances Derham, her secretary in the household. According to Starkey's analysis of later testimony, Catherine and Derham's relationship was intense, with Derham apparently considering them to be married through a pre-contract, a form of betrothal that in Tudor law could be nearly as binding as marriage. Catherine was perhaps 15 or 16, Derham was in his 20s, and their relationship was sexual, passionate, and conducted with the knowledge of other young people in the household who helped them meet secretly at night. In 1539, Catherine was brought to court by her family, who saw an opportunity to advance their interests by placing the attractive teenager in Queen Anne of Cleves's household. According to Starkey, King Henry VIII, who was 49 years old, fat, diseased, and in constant pain from an ulcerated leg, saw Catherine and was instantly infatuated. Henry was desperately unhappy in his 4th marriage to Anne of Cleves, whom he found physically repulsive. Catherine represented youth, beauty, vitality, everything Henry felt he had lost. Henry had his marriage to Anne annulled in July 1540 and married Catherine on the 28th of July 1540, making the teenager who had grown up in semi-poverty Queen of England. Catherine was not in love with Henry, according to Starkey. How could she be? Henry was 30 years older than Catherine, physically repulsive, with stinking leg wounds that required daily dressing, obese, tyrannical, and terrifying in his rages. But Catherine had been raised to be obedient, to please men, to advance her family's interests. She did her duty as queen, was friendly and charming, and Henry was besotted with her, showering her with gifts, and calling her his rose without a thorn. For a few months, according to Starkey, Catherine enjoyed being queen, having beautiful clothes and jewels, being flattered and sought after, even if it meant enduring a husband she didn't love. But then Catherine made a fatal mistake. She began an affair with Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the king's privy chamber, a young man close to Henry's own age and far more attractive than the aging king. According to Starkey, whether Catherine and Culpeper's relationship became physical remains debated, but at minimum it was an intense romantic connection, with Catherine and Culpeper meeting secretly at night, exchanging love letters, and taking enormous risks to be together. Catherine, according to Starkey, was seeking the romantic love and sexual passion that her marriage to Henry utterly lacked, turning to a young man who made her feel desirable for herself rather than for her position. In November 1541, Henry was informed about Catherine's relationship with Culpeper and about her earlier relationships with Manox and de Raham. According to Starkey, Henry initially refused to believe the accusations, but when confronted with evidence including love letters, he broke down, raging and weeping at Catherine's betrayal. An investigation revealed the full extent of Catherine's past relationships and her affair with Culpeper. Catherine was arrested, interrogated, and eventually confessed to meetings with Culpeper, but denied that their relationship had been consummated. The confessions, according to Starkey, probably saved Catherine from being burned at the stake, the traditional punishment for a queen's adultery, which constituted treason. Instead, Parliament passed an Act of Attainder against Catherine, and she was sentenced to be beheaded. On the 13th of February 1542, Catherine Howard was executed at the Tower of London. According to accounts analysed by Starkey, she was terrified, so weak that she had to be helped to the scaffold, and she died with some dignity, asking for prayers for her soul. She was 18 or 19 years old, had been queen for less than 18 months, and died because she had tried to find love and passion with someone her own age rather than accepting the loveless reality of her marriage to an old and diseased king. What makes Catherine Howard's story so heartbreaking, according to Starkey, is how young she was and how little agency she had in her own fate. Catherine was a teenager, poorly educated, given no real preparation for the role of queen, married to a man she didn't love and probably feared, and when she tried to find happiness elsewhere, she was killed for it. The men involved in her story, de Raham and Culpeper, were also executed, but the focus of history has always been on Catherine, blamed for her sexuality, her inability to resist temptation, her betrayal of the king. Starkey argues that Catherine was more victim than villainous, a girl who had been used by her family, by the king, by the men who seduced her, and who paid with her life for daring to want love and happiness. Let me tell you about Princess Cecilie of Greece and Denmark, whose love story had a tragically early ending that shocked royal Europe. Cecilie was born on the 22nd of June 1911 in Athens, the third daughter of Prince Andrew of Greece and Princess Alice of Battenberg. According to research by Hugo Vickers, whose work on the Greek royal family examines Cecilie's life, she grew up in a chaotic environment, with her family forced into exile from Greece when she was a child, living in reduced circumstances in Paris and England, her mother suffering from mental illness that eventually led to her institutionalization. In 1931, when Cecilie was 20, she married Georg Donatus, hereditary Grand Duke of Hesse, a match that reunited branches of the family that had divided generations earlier. According to Vickers, Cecilie and Georg Donatus were genuinely in love, a happy couple who produced 3 children between 1933 and 1937, 2 boys and a girl. They lived in Darmstadt, Germany, and according to accounts from family members analysed by Vickers, they were devoted parents and a loving couple who seemed to have found the happiness that had eluded so many of Cecily's relatives. But in November 1937, tragedy struck. Cecily's brother-in-law, Prince Ludwig of Hesse, was getting married in London, and Cecily and her family planned to attend the wedding. According to Vickers, Cecily was 8 months pregnant with her 4th child, but felt well enough to travel. On the 16th of November 1937, Cecily Georg Donatus, their 2 young sons, and Georg Donatus's mother Grand Duchess Eleanor boarded a plane to fly to London for the wedding. The plane crashed into a factory chimney near Ostend, Belgium. In fog, everyone on board was killed. According to accounts analysed by Vickers, the investigation into the crash revealed that Cecily had gone into labour during the flight, possibly causing the pilot to attempt an emergency landing that went tragically wrong. Cecily's body was found with the body of a newborn baby, apparently born during the crash or just before. The baby had lived long enough to take a breath, but died within moments. According to Vickers, the tragedy was compounded by the fact that Cecily's only surviving child, her 3-year-old daughter Johanna, died of meningitis less than 2 years later, in 1939, meaning that within 2 years, Cecily's entire immediate family had been wiped out. What makes Cecily's story heartbreaking, according to Vickers, is the cruel randomness of it. The way a decision to attend a family wedding turned into catastrophe. The way a happy love story, with 3 healthy children, ended in a plane crash that destroyed an entire generation of a royal family. Cecily was just 26 years old when she died, with her whole life ahead of her, and she died in arguably the most terrible way imaginable, in a plane crash while in labour, with her children and husband dying beside her, giving birth to a baby who lived only moments. The waste and horror of it haunted European royalty for years, a reminder of how fragile life was, and how quickly happiness could turn to tragedy. Let me tell you about Queen Astrid of Belgium, whose brief life and tragic death made her one of the most beloved royal figures of the 1930s. Astrid was born on the 17th of November 1905 in Stockholm, Sweden, the 3rd daughter of Prince Carl of Sweden, Duke of Västergland. According to research by Theo Aronson, whose work on European royalty examines Astrid's life, she grew up as a relatively minor member of the Swedish royal family, beautiful, kind, and noted for her genuine warmth and lack of royal pretension. In 1926, Astrid married Prince Leopold of Belgium, heir to the Belgian throne, in a love match that delighted both families. According to Aronson, Astrid and Leopold had met and fallen in love over several years, and their marriage was celebrated as a union of genuine affection rather than mere dynastic necessity. Astrid moved to Belgium and won hearts immediately with her charm, her unpretentiousness, and her obvious happiness. She gave birth to 3 children between 1927 and 1934, Princess Josephine, Charlotte, Prince Baudouin, and Prince Albert. In 1934, Leopold's father, King Albert, died in a climbing accident, and Leopold and Astrid became king and queen of the Belgians. According to Aronson, Astrid was an immensely popular queen, beloved by Belgian people for her warmth, her devotion to her family, and her tireless work on charitable causes. She seemed to represent everything a modern queen should be: beautiful, charming, dutiful, but also accessible and genuinely caring about ordinary people. But on the 29th of August 1935, tragedy struck. Leopold and Astrid were on holiday in Switzerland, and Leopold was driving them through the Swiss Alps near Lake Lucerne. According to the accident investigation analysed by Aronson, Leopold apparently looked down at a map for a moment, lost control of the car, and crashed into a tree. Astrid was thrown from the car and killed instantly. She was 29 years old, had been queen for barely a year, and died in a moment of horrible randomness, leaving behind 3 young children, including the future King Baudouin, who was just 5 years old. According to Aronson, Leopold was devastated, blaming himself for Astrid's death, falling into a depression that affected him for years. Belgium went into deep mourning for a queen who had seemed to embody grace and goodness. Astrid's funeral was attended by royalty from across Europe, all coming to mourn a woman who had died far too young, whose love story with Leopold had seemed blessed, but had ended in a Swiss mountain road with sudden terrible finality. What makes Astrid's story so poignant, according to Aronson, is the sense of promise unfulfilled. Astrid had everything: a happy marriage, healthy children, a position where she could do enormous good, and she seemed perfectly suited to her role in a way that many royal women were not. Her death felt particularly cruel because she had seemed so blessed, because she was taken at the height of her happiness and usefulness, because there was no illness or warning, just a moment's inattention, and a beautiful life ended. Leopold eventually remarried, but according to Aronson, he never forgot Astrid, and their children grew up knowing that their mother had been someone special, someone who had been deeply loved and deeply mourned. Now let me tell you about Empress Elizabeth of Austria-Hungary again, but this time focusing on a relationship that many historians believe was the great love of her life, her connection with Hungarian Count Gyula Andrissy. According to research by Brigitte Hamann, while Elizabeth's unhappy marriage to Franz Joseph is well documented, her relationship with Andrissy was more complex and more important to her emotional life than most romantic relationships. Gyula Andrissy was born in 1823, 14 years before Elizabeth, into one of Hungary's most prominent aristocratic families. According to Hamann, Andrissy was a Hungarian nationalist who participated in the Hungarian Revolution of 1848 to 1849 against Austrian rule, was sentenced to death in absentia after the revolution failed, and spent years in exile before being pardoned and allowed to return to Hungary in 1858. He was handsome, brilliant, politically astute, and passionately devoted to Hungarian interests. Elizabeth met Andrissy in the 1860s. According to Hamann, during one of her visits to Hungary, she fell in love with Hungary and with Hungarian culture, learning the difficult Magyar language, advocating for Hungarian interests at the Austrian court, and working toward the Compromise of 1867 that created the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary, giving Hungary significant autonomy while maintaining Habsburg rule. According to Hamann, Elizabeth's love for Hungary was inseparable from her feelings for Andrissy, who represented everything she found beautiful about the nation: passionate, proud, independent, minded. Whether Elizabeth and Andrissy's relationship ever became physical remains one of history's great mysteries. According to Hamann's analysis of correspondence and contemporary accounts, they were extremely close, spent considerable time together, and clearly had deep emotional and intellectual. Some historians believe they were lovers. Others argue that their relationship remained platonic, but intensely emotional. What seems clear, according to Hamann, is that Andrissy understood Elizabeth in ways that Franz Joseph never did, provided her with intellectual stimulation and emotional support that her marriage utterly lacked, and represented to her a world of possibility and passion that contrasted with the stifling formality of the Viennese court. Andrissy became Austrian foreign minister in 1871, and later prime minister, giving him frequent legitimate reasons to meet with Elizabeth to discuss Hungarian affairs. According to Hamann, Franz Joseph appears to have tolerated the relationship, either because he trusted Elizabeth and Andrissy to remain within the bounds of propriety, or because he recognized that trying to separate them would only make Elizabeth more miserable and more likely to spend even more time away from Vienna. Their relationship continued for decades, with Andrissy serving as Elizabeth's political advisor, confidant, and possibly her lover until his death in 1890. When Andrissy died, according to accounts analysed by Hamann, Elizabeth was devastated. She had already been in mourning since 1889 when her son Rudolf died at Mayerling, Andrissie's death removed one of the last sources of joy and meaning in her life. In the 8 years between Andrissie's death in 1890 and her own assassination in 1898, according to Hamann, Elizabeth became even more reclusive, more focused on death and dying, wearing black always, and saying that she was just waiting for her own end. What makes Elizabeth and Andrissie's relationship significant, according to Hamann, is that it shows how royal women could find emotional and intellectual connection outside their marriages, how such relationships could be sustained for decades even when physical intimacy may or may not have been part of them, and how important such relationships were to women trapped in loveless royal marriages. Whether or not Elizabeth and Androssie were lovers in the physical sense, according to Hamann, Androssie was the love of Elizabeth's life in every way that mattered. He understood her, challenged her intellectually, shared her passions and interests, and made her feel valued as a person rather than just as an empress and breeding machine. Their relationship, conducted largely in secret through letters and private meetings, represented the emotional life that Elizabeth hid from the world. The self she could be with Androssie that she could never be with Franz Joseph. Now, let me tell you about Anne Boleyn, second wife of King Henry VIII of England, whose love story began with passion and promise and ended with accusations, betrayal, and execution. Anne was born around 1501 or 1507, the exact date uncertain, the daughter of Thomas Boleyn, a diplomat and courtier, according to research by Eric Ives, whose biography of Anne Boleyn is considered the definitive scholarly work on her life. Anne spent several years in her youth at the French court, serving in the household of Queen Claude of France, where she received an education and sophistication that was unusual for English women of her time. Anne returned to England around 1521 or 1522 and joined the court of Queen Catherine of Aragon as a lady-in-waiting. According to Ives, Anne was not a conventional beauty by the standards of her time. She was dark-haired and dark-eyed in an era that prized blonde fairness, but she was charming, witty, musically talented, and had a charisma that attracted attention. By 1526, King Henry VIII, who had been unhappily married to Catherine of Aragon for 17 years, and desperate for a male heir that Catherine had failed to provide, had become infatuated with Anne. Henry's pursuit of Anne, according to Ives, began as it had with many of his previous mistresses. He expected Anne to become his lover while he remained married to Catherine, but Anne refused. According to Ives's analysis of Henry's love letters to Anne, which survived and provide rare insight into their relationship, Anne made clear that she would not become Henry's mistress, that if he wanted her, he would have to marry her. This was an extraordinarily bold position for a woman to take with a king, particularly a king as powerful and volatile as Henry VIII. But Anne, according to Ives, understood that her value lay precisely in her refusal to give Henry what he wanted too easily, that she could demand marriage, because Henry's desire for her was intense enough that he was willing to overturn his entire world to have her, and overturn his world he did. According to Ives, from approximately 1527 onward, Henry became obsessed with ending his marriage to Catherine and marrying Anne. He sought an annulment from the Pope, arguing that his marriage to Catherine had been invalid because she had previously been married to his deceased older brother Arthur. When the Pope refused to grant the annulment, largely because Catherine's nephew was the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who opposed the annulment, Henry took the extraordinary step of breaking with Rome entirely, declaring himself supreme head of the Church of England, and granting himself an annulment through the newly subordinate English clergy. The 7 years between Henry's first pursuit of Anne and their eventual marriage in 1533, according to Ives, were years of enormous tension and uncertainty for Anne. She was hated by many at court and in England generally, who saw her as a homewrecker destroying the marriage of the beloved Queen Catherine. She was in a legally and socially ambiguous position, acknowledged as Henry's future wife, but not yet his wife, with all the vulnerability that position entailed. She had to fend off Henry's sexual advances, while keeping him interested enough to continue his pursuit of the annulment, a delicate balancing act that required constant vigilance. And she knew that her entire future depended on Henry's continued desire for her, that if he lost interest before the marriage took place, she would be ruined, having rejected all other suitors and gained a reputation as Henry's woman without the security of actually being his wife. Finally, in January 1533, Anne and Henry married in secret. Anne was already pregnant, a pregnancy that had probably prompted the secret marriage, since Henry was desperate for a legitimate male heir. According to Ives, the pregnancy strengthened Anne's position, giving Henry even more incentive to complete the break with Rome and ensure that his child with Anne would be legitimate. In May 1533, Henry's marriage to Catherine was formally declared invalid, and in June 1533, Anne was crowned Queen of England in a spectacular ceremony designed to demonstrate her legitimacy and status. But then Anne gave birth in September 1533, and the child was a girl, the future Elizabeth I, according to Ives. Henry was bitterly disappointed. He had risked everything for Anne, had broken with Rome, had defied the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor, all because he was desperate for a male heir and believed that Anne would give him sons. The birth of a daughter was a devastating blow to Henry's expectations and to Anne's security. Anne needed to produce a son to justify her position and to secure her safety. Anne became pregnant again, according to Ives, but miscarried in the summer of 1534. She became pregnant a third time in 1535, but in January 1536 she miscarried again, and this time the fetus was male, meaning that Anne had lost the son that might have saved her. According to Ives, by early 1536, Henry's passion for Anne had cooled. The woman he had pursued for 7 years and overturned his kingdom to marry had proven unable to give him the sons he desperately wanted. Henry was now infatuated with Jane Seymour, one of Anne's own ladies in waiting, and he wanted to be free to marry her. In May 1536, Anne was arrested and charged with adultery with multiple men, including her own brother George Boleyn. Charges that Ives and virtually all modern historians agree were false, manufactured by Henry's chief minister Thomas Cromwell to give Henry grounds to have the marriage annulled and Anne removed. Anne was tried, convicted on the basis of evidence that Ives characterises as flimsy and contradictory, and sentenced to death. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn was beheaded at the Tower of London by an expert swordsman brought from France for the execution. She was in her early 30s, had been queen for less than 3 years, and died because she had failed to give Henry a son and because Henry wanted her gone. What makes Anne Boleyn's story so heartbreaking, according to Ives, is the tragic irony of it all. Anne fought for 7 years to become queen, convinced Henry to break with Rome and create the Church of England, achieved a position of power and influence that no English queen consort had held for generations, and it all collapsed in less than 3 years because of biology she couldn't control. Anne's failure to produce sons wasn't her fault. We now know that the sex of a child is determined by the father's sperm, not the mother's egg. But in Tudor England, women were blamed for failing to produce male heirs. And Anne, who had been bold and ambitious, and had dared to demand that a king marry her, paid for that ambition with her life when she couldn't fulfill the one duty that mattered most. The tragedy is deepened, according to Ives, by the knowledge that Anne's daughter Elizabeth would become one of England's greatest monarchs, that the daughter Henry viewed as a disappointment would vindicate Anne's legacy in ways Anne never lived to see. Elizabeth never forgot her mother referred to Anne as that woman in public because it was dangerous to defend a woman who had been executed as an adulteress and a traitor, but privately apparently cherished Anne's memory and wore a ring with Anne's portrait in it. Anne's story shows the terrible price of royal ambition, the vulnerability of women whose value was measured entirely by their ability to produce sons, and the cruelty of a system that executed women for failing to achieve biological outcomes they had no control over. Let me tell you about Princess Sophie of Bavaria, who became Archduchess of Austria. whose secret love had consequences that rippled through history in ways she never imagined. Sophie was born on the 27th of January 1805, the daughter of King Maximilian I Joseph of Bavaria. According to research by Brigitte Hamann, whose work on the Habsburg family examines Sophie's life, Sophie was beautiful, intelligent, and ambitious, traits that shaped her life and the history of Europe. In 1824, when Sophie was 19, she was married to Archduke Franz Karl of Austria, son of Emperor Franz I. According to Hamann, the marriage was arranged for dynastic reasons, uniting the Bavarian Wittelsbachs with the Austrian Habsburgs. Franz Karl was weak-willed and intellectually limited, a man who had no interest in politics and little capacity for it. Sophie, by contrast, was politically astute and ambitious. According to Hamann, Sophie quickly realized that her husband would never amount to anything significant, but she also realized that their son might inherit the Austrian throne, and she determined to make sure that if that happened, her son would be prepared to rule and she would be there to guide him. But according to persistent rumors analyzed by Hamann, Sophie's marriage to Franz Karl was not only politically disappointing, but also personally unfulfilling. Sophie took a lover, and not just any lover, but Napoleon's son, Napoleon II, Duke of Reichstadt, who lived at the Austrian court as essentially a prisoner, denied his father's legacy but unable to escape the Habsburg control. According to Hamann, Sophie and Napoleon II, who was several years younger than Sophie, developed an intense relationship in the late 1820s and early 1830s. Whether the relationship was physical remains debated, but it was certainly emotional and possibly romantic. Napoleon II died of tuberculosis in 1832 at age 21. According to Hamann, Sophie was reportedly devastated, but rumours persisted and have persisted into modern times that Sophie and Napoleon II's relationship had produced a child, that this child was passed off as Franz Karl's son, and that this child was none other than Franz Joseph, who would become Emperor of Austria in 1848 and would rule for 68 years. According to Hamann, the rumour that Franz Joseph was actually Napoleon the son, rather than Franz Karl's, has circulated for nearly 2 centuries, fed by Franz Joseph's physical resemblance to Napoleon I and by the obvious lack of resemblance to Franz Karl. Modern historians, including Hamann, generally reject this rumour, pointing out that the dates don't quite work, and that there is no concrete evidence beyond gossip and physical resemblance, which could be coincidental. But, according to Hamann, what is significant about the rumour is that it was believed by many contemporaries that Sophie's reputation was damaged by it, and that whether or not the rumour was true, it reveals the reality that royal women's sexual conduct was always subject to scrutiny and speculation, that affairs and illegitimate children were assumed to happen even when they might not have, and that women bore the social consequences of rumours in ways that men rarely did. What we know for certain, according to Hamann, is that Sophie was a powerful political figure behind the scenes in the Habsburg Empire. When revolutions swept Europe in 1848, Emperor Ferdinand I, who was epileptic and intellectually disabled, abdicated. Franz Karl, who was next in line, was persuaded to renounce his rights to the throne, and Franz Joseph, Sophie's eldest son, became emperor at age 18. According to Hamann, Sophie was the driving force behind this arrangement, the one who manoeuvred to ensure that her son became emperor, and that she would have enormous influence over him. For the next decade, according to Hamann, Sophie was the power behind the throne, advising Franz Joseph, influencing policy, and attempting to control his personal life, including his choice of bride. Sophie wanted Franz Joseph to marry her sister's daughter Helene, but as we discussed earlier, Franz Joseph insisted on marrying Helene's younger sister Elizabeth, the woman who became Empress Elizabeth, and who had such an unhappy reign and life. According to Hamann, Sophie and Elizabeth's relationship was terrible from the start. two strong-willed women fighting for influence over Franz Joseph, with Sophie initially having the upper hand because of her long influence over her son. The conflict between Sophie and Elizabeth over Franz Joseph's affections and over the raising of Elizabeth's children poisoned the imperial family for years. According to Hammond, Sophie was protective of her position and influence, seeing Elizabeth as an immature girl who didn't understand imperial responsibilities. Elizabeth saw Sophie as a domineering tyrant who was destroying her marriage and stealing her children. Franz Joseph, caught between his mother and his wife, typically sided with his mother, at least in the early years, causing Elizabeth enormous pain and contributing to her retreat from court life. Sophie died in 1872 at age 67, having outlived her husband Franz Karl by 16 years. According to Hammond, Sophie's last years were marked by declining health and declining influence, as Franz Joseph matured and increasingly made his own decisions without consulting his mother. Sophie's story, according to Hammond, illustrates the complex reality of royal women's power. She wielded enormous influence through her son, shaped the course of the Habsburg Empire, and yet was always operating behind the scenes. Her power dependent on male relatives, and always vulnerable to being displaced by younger women. The tragedy of Sophie's story, according to Hammond, is that her ambition and her wielding of power through her son contributed to the unhappiness of so many people around her, including her own son Franz Joseph, who was thrust onto the throne as a teenager and spent 68 years burdened by responsibilities he never truly wanted, and his wife Elizabeth, whose misery was partly caused by Sophie's interference. Sophie's alleged affair with Napoleon II, true or not, was symptomatic of a life where personal happiness had to be pursued in secret, where passion and love had to be hidden because they threatened the careful political arrangements that governed royal life. Now let me tell you about Princess Pauline of Württemberg, whose love story was complicated by mental illness, religious mania, and a husband's cruelty. A tale that shows how royal women who didn't conform to expected norms could be treated as mad and imprisoned for years. Pauline was born on the 4th of September 1800, the daughter of Duke Louis of Württemberg. According to research by Karen Feuerstein-Prasser, whose work on tragic royal women examines Pauline's life, Pauline was beautiful, intelligent, and deeply religious, traits that would shape her tumultuous life. In 1820, when Pauline was 20, she was married to King William I of Württemberg, her first cousin, and a man 38 years her senior. According to Feuerstein-Prasser, William I was a notorious libertine, obese, cruel, and utterly unsuited to marriage with a young and idealistic bride. The marriage was arranged entirely for political reasons, keeping the throne in the family, and gave no consideration to the enormous age gap or the incompatibility of temperaments. Pauline, according to Feuerstein-Prasser, was miserable from the start. William treated her with contempt, was openly unfaithful, and subjected her to cruelties both psychological and possibly physical. Pauline sought solace in intense religious devotion, spending hours in prayer, fasting, and seeking spiritual experiences. According to Feuerstein-Prasser, Pauline's religiosity was initially tolerated as acceptable for a queen, but as it intensified and as Pauline began to have visions and religious ecstasies, William and his courtiers began to view her behaviour as evidence of madness. In 1823, 3 years into the marriage, Pauline gave birth to daughters, twins who died shortly after birth. According to Feuerstein-Prasser, the loss devastated Pauline and intensified her religious mania. She became convinced that she was being punished by God, that she needed to atone for sins, and she engaged in increasingly extreme forms of religious devotion, including prolonged fasting, that damaged her health. William, according to Feuerstein-Prasser, used Pauline's behaviour as grounds to have her declared mentally incompetent. In 1824, Pauline was removed from Stuttgart and confined to Ludwigsburg Palace, essentially imprisoned on grounds of insanity. For the next 5 years, according to Feuerstein-Prasser, Pauline was held against her will, separated from what little family support she had, denied visitors except those approved by William, and subjected to treatments for her supposed madness that included isolation, restraints, and various medications. Pauline's letters from this period, analysed by Feuerstein-Prasser, reveal a woman who was not insane, but who was desperately unhappy, who understood that she was being imprisoned by a husband who wanted her out of the way, and who had no recourse, because as a woman and as someone declared incompetent, she had no legal rights to defend herself. In 1829, William I died, and Pauline, who was just 29 years old, was finally freed from confinement. According to Feuerstein-Prasser, Pauline withdrew from public life, lived quietly, and died in 1873, at age 73, having spent the last 4 decades of her life in obscurity. Pauline's story, according to Feuerstein-Prasser, illustrates how royal women who exhibited behaviour deemed inappropriate, whether due to actual mental illness, religious devotion, or simply unhappiness with their circumstances, could be labelled mad and imprisoned, their entire lives destroyed by husbands and families who found them inconvenient. What makes Pauline's story particularly heartbreaking, according to Feuerstein-Prasser, is that we will never know whether Pauline was actually mentally ill or whether her religious mania was a response to an intolerable situation, a way of coping with a cruel husband and a loveless marriage. The historical record shows a woman who was imprisoned, who had no power to defend herself, and who was silenced for decades. Whether Pauline was mad or merely desperate, according to Feuerstein-Prasser, she deserved compassion and help, not imprisonment and isolation, and her story shows the terrible vulnerability of royal women who could be locked away by male relatives with minimal legal process or protection. Let me tell you about Queen Maria Luisa of Spain, wife of King Charles IV, whose notorious love affair with Manuel Godoy essentially made her lover the most powerful man in Spain and contributed to the downfall of the Spanish monarchy. Maria Luisa was born on the 9th of December, 1751, the daughter of Duke Philip of Parma. According to research by Charles Esdale, whose work on Spain in the Napoleonic era examines Maria Luisa's political role, she was married at age 14 to Charles, Prince of Asturias and heir to the Spanish throne. In a typical arranged royal marriage, the marriage produced numerous children, but according to Esdale, it was not a happy union intellectually or emotionally. Charles was weak-willed, uninterested in governance, and preferred hunting to ruling. When Charles became King Charles IV in 1788, according to Esdale, it was clear that Maria Luisa would be the more politically engaged partner, and she quickly became the real power behind the throne, advising on policy, appointing ministers, and essentially running the government while Charles hunted and pursued his hobbies. In the early 1790s, Maria Luisa met Manuel Godoy, a young guardsman from a minor noble family who was handsome, ambitious, and charming. According to Esdale, Maria Luisa and Godoy became lovers, and she used her influence to promote him rapidly through military and government ranks. By 1792, when Godoy was just 25 years old, Maria Luisa had made him Prime Minister of Spain, the most powerful position in government. According to Esdale, the rapidity of Godoy's rise and his youth made it obvious to everyone that he was Maria Luisa's lover, and the arrangement became one of the worst-kept secrets in Europe. What makes Maria Luisa's story unusual, according to Esdale, is that the affair was not only tolerated, but apparently accepted by King Charles IV himself. According to contemporary accounts analysed by Esdale, Charles appears to have been aware of the relationship between his wife and Godoy and to have accepted it, possibly because he was too weak to oppose Maria Luisa, possibly because he valued Godoy's service to the crown, or possibly because Charles himself was engaged in his own extramarital relationships and found the arrangement convenient. The result was a bizarre managed tosse-trosse, where Maria Luisa, Charles and Godoy lived and worked together, with Godoy functioning as Prime Minister, as Maria Luisa's lover, and apparently as Charles's friend. For nearly 2 decades, according to Esdale, this arrangement continued, with Godoy wielding enormous power, making policy decisions, enriching himself through his position, and remaining Maria Luisa's devoted lover and Charles's faithful servant. But the arrangement was deeply unpopular with the Spanish people and nobility, who resented Godoy's power, his lowly origins, and his scandalous relationship with the Queen. Anti-Godoy sentiment, according to Esdale, became conflated with anti-monarchy sentiment, damaging the reputation of the royal family. When Napoleon invaded Spain in 1808, the crisis that had been building for years finally exploded. In March 1808, there was a popular uprising against Charles IV and Godoy, with mobs attacking Godoy's palace and nearly killing him. Charles IV was forced to abdicate in favour of his son Ferdinand Feven, and Maria Luisa and Charles went into exile, taking Godoy with them. According to Esdale, the three of them lived together in exile for the rest of their lives, first in France and then in Italy, maintaining their strange relationship until Charles died in 1819, and Maria Luisa died in 1819, just 2 weeks after Charles. What makes Maria Luisa's story significant, according to Esdale, is that she was a royal woman who openly defied convention, who took a lover and didn't bother to hide it, who wielded political power openly rather than behind the scenes, and who paid a price for it in the loss of her throne and her reputation, but who apparently never regretted her choices. Maria Luisa's relationship with Godoy was not a hidden love affair, but an open arrangement that everyone knew about, and in that sense it was both shocking for its brazenness and liberating for its refusal to play by rules that required royal affairs to be discreet, and women to pretend they had no sexual or emotional desires. The tragedy, according to Esdale, is that Maria Luisa's openness and her exercise of power contributed to the downfall of the Spanish monarchy, that her refusal to conform to expectations of queenly behaviour fed popular resentment and made the monarchy vulnerable when Napoleon invaded. Maria Luisa's story shows both the possibilities and the dangers for royal women who refused to hide their relationships and who insisted on wielding power openly. She achieved a level of agency and openness about her personal life that most royal women could only dream of. But she also demonstrated why most royal women were so careful to maintain appearances, because defying convention openly could have devastating political consequences. Now, let me tell you about Princess Elizabeth of Russia, daughter of Peter the Great, who lived through decades of court intrigue, survived multiple threats to her life and freedom, and found love in the most unexpected place with a man she could never publicly acknowledge as her husband. Elizabeth was born on the 29th of December, 1709, the daughter of Peter the Great and Catherine I of Russia. According to research by Robert Massey, whose biography of Peter the Great provides context for Elizabeth's early life, Elizabeth grew up during her father's reign, a beautiful and vivacious princess who was adored by Peter and expected to make a brilliant dynastic marriage. But Peter died in 1725 when Elizabeth was just 15, and the following decades were marked by palace coups, competing claims to the throne, and constant danger for members of the Romanov family. Elizabeth's mother Catherine I reigned briefly before dying in 1727. Peter II, Elizabeth's nephew, reigned next and died in 1730. Anna, Peter the Great's niece, then seized the throne and reigned from 1730 to 1740. And during Anna's reign, Elizabeth lived in constant fear, knowing that as Peter the Great's daughter, she was a potential rival to Anna and could be eliminated at any time. According to Massey, Elizabeth survived this dangerous period by presenting herself as frivolous and non-threatening, spending her time on fashion and parties and apparently having no political ambitions, all while carefully cultivating support among the Guard regiments. During these years, according to research by Evgeny Anisimov, whose work on Elizabeth's reign examines her life, Elizabeth had a secret relationship with Alexei Razumovsky, a Ukrainian Cossack singer who had been brought to court because of his beautiful voice. Razumovsky was handsome, charming, and devoted to Elizabeth, and she fell deeply in love with him despite the enormous gulf in their social stations. According to Anisimov, Elizabeth and Razumovsky's relationship was sexual and emotional, and rumour held that they were secretly married, though no documentary evidence of a marriage has ever been found. In 1741, when Elizabeth was 31, she led a coup that deposed the infant Emperor Ivan V and his mother, the regent Anna Leopoldovna. Elizabeth became Empress of Russia and would reign for 21 years until her death in 1762. According to Anisimov, one of Elizabeth's first acts as Empress was to raise Razumovsky to the nobility, giving him titles and wealth, and making him one of the most powerful men at court. Everyone knew that Razumovsky was Elizabeth's lover, and many believed he was secretly her husband, but Elizabeth never publicly acknowledged the relationship as a marriage, perhaps because doing so would have raised uncomfortable questions about Razumovsky's low birth, and whether any children they might have would be legitimate heirs to the throne. Elizabeth and Razumovsky's relationship lasted until Elizabeth's death in 1762. According to Anisimov, Razumovsky remained devoted to Elizabeth throughout her reign, never taking political power in his own name, despite having the Empress's favour, and apparently content to remain in the background while Elizabeth ruled. Elizabeth, for her part, was faithful to Razumovsky, despite opportunities to take other lovers, and contemporary accounts analysed by Anisimov suggest that theirs was a genuine love match that endured for over 20 years. But Elizabeth never had children, or at least none that were publicly acknowledged. According to Anisimov, this was partly by choice, because Elizabeth knew that any child by Razumovsky would have dubious legitimacy and would create succession problems, and partly perhaps because of infertility issues. The lack of heirs meant that when Elizabeth died in 1762, the throne passed to her nephew Peter III, the son of her deceased older sister Anna. Peter was German, born unpopular in Russia, and was deposed within 6 months by his wife Catherine, who became Catherine the Great. What makes Elizabeth's story poignant, according to Anisimov, is that she achieved a level of personal happiness in her relationship with Razumovsky that was rare for monarchs, but she had to keep that relationship technically ambiguous, neither fully hidden nor fully acknowledged, existing in a space between public secret and private marriage. Elizabeth wielded absolute power as Empress, could have declared Razumovsky her husband by fiat, but she chose not to, perhaps understanding that even an empress had to respect certain social boundaries, that legitimizing a marriage to a man of Razumovsky's origins might weaken her own authority and create problems she didn't want to deal with. Razumovsky lived until 1771, dying 9 years after Elizabeth, and spending those years in retirement, mourning the woman who had loved him and elevated him, and with whom he had spent over 20 years in a relationship that everyone knew about, but no one could quite define. According to Anisimov, Razumovsky never remarried after Elizabeth died, remaining faithful to her memory, and he was reportedly buried with Elizabeth's portrait and letters, taking their secrets to the grave with him. Thank you for joining me tonight on this journey through centuries of royal heartbreak, through palaces and prisons, through love letters hidden and destroyed, through choices that tore hearts apart, and sacrifices that shaped history. I hope these stories have moved you, have helped you understand that behind every crown and title were women with beating hearts, who wanted nothing more than to love and be loved freely, women who made impossible choices between duty and desire, between security and passion, between what the world demanded and what their hearts wanted. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, I want you to think about the freedom you have, freedoms that these royal women could only dream of. You can love whom you choose. You can marry whom you will, or choose not to marry at all. You can leave relationships that don't serve you. You can follow your heart without asking permission from kings or parliaments or churches. These freedoms, which you might take for granted as you lie in bed tonight, were purchased through the suffering of countless women across centuries who were denied those same freedoms, who loved in secret, who mourned in silence, who sacrificed everything for brief moments of authentic connection. Sweet dreams, and may you wake tomorrow with gratitude for your freedom to live and love authentically, to write your own love story, rather than having it written for you by duty and dynasty. Sleep well knowing that every time you choose love freely, every time you honor your own heart's desires, you are exercising a freedom that women like Margaret and Diana and Elizabeth fought for in their own ways, even when that fight cost them everything. Good night, dear friends, and may your own love stories be filled with the joy, freedom, and authenticity that these royal women were so often denied. Remember them, honor them, and cherish the freedoms their suffering helped create.